Good morning. Good morning. The Lord be with you. There we go. We're going to get started, and our panelists are going to come out, and we're going to have a prayer, and Brad will give us a land acknowledgement, and then we'll begin with some time, about 45 minutes or so of conversation among us, and then you'll have time for some questions, and then we'll give you some directions about our lunch and our service this afternoon. Thank you. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving Creator, we give you thanks for this day, a time of remembrance, of acknowledgement, of entering into the stories of others and listening with our hearts and our complete spirits so that we may know you through the relationships we build here today. We ask this all in Christ's name. Amen. Brad, I'm going to ask you to do a land acknowledgement for us. You have to, there's a button in the middle.
Oh, the microphone. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Or I should say, Wunikasak, mean good day, or good morning in Wampanoag. Thank you all for having me here today. I want to acknowledge the land that this church is on and the land that we typically stand upon every day. In eastern Massachusetts, for over 12,000 years, my people, the Wampanoag people, have lived in this region of the world and have called it home and have taken care of it. For over 12,000 years, we have ranged throughout these forests, and we have engaged with the waterways in meaningful ways, and we continue to do that today. Today in Plymouth, there is a Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe. I myself come from the Aquina Wampanoag tribe, located on the island of Martha's Vineyard. There are also the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Seekonk, Pocasset, Chappaquiddick, and several other Wampanoag communities throughout here in Massachusetts. And there are also other Indigenous communities here as well. This is home to a wide variety of Native folks. But today, the land we stand on is Wampanoag land. And for over 12,000 years, my ancestors have called it home and continue to. Today, it is still an area that my relatives, my family, and I inhabit. And many people that you may interact with each day might be Wampanoag. You may not even know it. That's one of the things that I try to set in my job at Plymouth Patuxet Museums, is that we are also still a people of today, and it's why I dress the way I do and why I do what I do. Not only are we a people of today, but we're a people of the future as well. So not only are we growing as a tribal nation, but we continue to develop into new fields and change the world. And Native folks are changing the world all around you today, here in what is now the United States. And you can't have U.S. history without Indigenous history. And I come from an education background, coming out of the classroom directly the last 5 years. So I ask of all of you today, as you navigate Wampanoag land, and as you may be on the waterways, or maybe driving through the highways, or even just cruising through your normal tabs online, is to act. And I say that because a land acknowledgement isn't enough. It's just the beginning step of your relationship with Native folks. Eventually, land acknowledgement requires land back, and it requires other efforts. It requires reconciliation, and it requires building reciprocal relationships. And that's the goal that we have to shoot for. So even if it's small, even if it's just a small donation or supporting Native vendors, or whether it's big, like pushing the State House or pushing the national government to make changes, please act for Native folks. Stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. I think it's the best way forward. Kutapatush, Kutapatanamu, thank you. Thank you all for having me, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you all.
Wado, which is thank you in my language, Cherokee. I'm going to begin by asking each of our panelists just to talk about their people and where they come from. And Martha is directing me to make sure that we hold our the microphone close to your mouth, you guys, so that we make sure folks can hear us. And I want to start with my little sister, Cornelia.
Yad Sheyaha Cornelia Eaton, Yinshye Ashihin Ashlin Hashlishni Bashichin, Nakadane Dashanalit Ashie Dashache Egit Au Yaha E Asanishle. Thank you. I'm Cornelia, Reverend Canon Cornelia Easton. I come from the Episcopal Church in Navajo land on the Navajo Nation. I just shared my clan, my ancestral clan, which is the Salt clan, my maternal clan. And then I am born for my father's clan, the Mud clan people. And then my paternal grandfather clan is the Mexican people, and my maternal grandfather's clan are the Red Street people. And so those are the 4 clans that I introduce myself with. As you know, the 4 clans, as my brother Brad had talked about, land acknowledgement, comes from the earth. The Salt clan, the Mud clan, the Mexican people clan, and also the Red Street clan. And it's really important for me to acknowledge our Earth Mother. We say Nahastan Shama Shadcha Shije'eh, which is the Father, the sky. So I'm very grateful in this way. And I also would like to say that I'm very grateful to be here, to be present here with all of you, and especially to this land of Indigenous peoples. I come from the 4 sacred mountains, from the Navajo land on the reservation near Arizona, well, actually in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. So I come from a desert people with many desert medicines. So I come here also to this coastal land among my relatives, and I call them my grandmother would say that this is a coastal Dene, the people of this coastal land, and they're very sacred people, and it's because it's where the sun rises, and each morning when the sun rises, they are healing people. They have a lot of courage, and they pray, and they are near the waters, and they say that, she said that this water is called Ntkel, it stretches all the way along the dawn, and they're the dawn people, and that's how they're my relatives. So I want to say thank you for welcoming me here, and from such a far away place, but we're rooted, interconnected through our mother, the earth, through her veins, and that's what roots us together. So this morning, as I was welcomed here, I was gifted with sage and pinon needles, and I was adoring these just the other day on my walk, and I said, wow, how beautiful you are, Shaman Hassan, along the coastal lands, my earth mother, how beautiful you are. And so these medicines I will take home with me, and I will use it, and I will use it also to heal among my people in the Dene Bikea, from the Navajo people, because we use these medicines as well. They're very sacred to us. They make us who we are. They're a part of us. And so the sage, the white sage, I will use for this winter for my medicine. What we use for this medicine is we boil it, and it goes back to the water, and then we inhale the aroma, that beauty, that smell, and it becomes part of us. And that's how healing happens for each and every one of us. And I will pray that for this place and for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cornelia, and welcome to Wampanoag land. So, as I said before, my name is Brad Lopes. I'm a Quina Wampanoag. My people come from Martha's Vineyard, or as we call it, Nopi or Noepe, which essentially is like saying dry land. And that has been our home for over 12,000 years. And I'll tell you a short story. We always talk about how it was created in the first place, such a sanctuary. It's in many ways, paradise, especially for us who are connected to the land. In our language, the word for our body is the same exact word as the word for the land. And it's because they're the same thing. When you harm the land, you harm your body, and vice versa. And we always talk about a giant. His name is Mashep. Mashep is not special per se in anything other than his height. He is huge. I always told my students he was a huge dude. And he would roam around, and he loved the south coast of Massachusetts. It was his favorite area in the whole world. And Mashep wanted to share this. He wanted to share this beautiful region with people. And he knew our people because he was part of our people. So one day he decided he was going to share it with us. And he wanted us to be safe. So he takes us in his arms because that's how huge he is. And he brings us along the coast until we eventually get to what will eventually be Martha's Vineyard. At the time, it's connected to the mainland, just like it was 12,000 years ago. As Mashep turns around after he drops us off on the island, as he turns around to go back and get more, he accidentally drags his toe. And he's so huge, he creates a channel, and it fills with water. And all of a sudden, he recognizes he's created even more of a sanctuary in his favorite place, and it becomes special. Today, if you travel to Aquina, there are cliffs in Aquina. They are sacred. Please do not touch them because they're slowly fading away, unfortunately. Only tribal members can interact with them because that clay is sacred to us. We've made stuff out of it and worked with it for thousands of years. It is red, it is gray, it is yellow, it is black. It is every color that you can imagine. It is beautiful. And that is a creation of Mashep and his time and his energy, and that's where he sat. And today, every action we take, we think of Mashep and what he would do and how he would take care of the land. And so today, as an educator, my job, my role is really to share more about my people, the Wampanoag people, but also the ways and aspects of our people that I think the whole world can benefit from and learn from. There's always something to learn, especially from Native folks. We've been saying things for a long time, and I'm glad people are now listening. So thank you for being here to listen.
Good morning, I'm Allison Miller, and I'm Pecasset Wampanoag, direct descendant of Massasoit, 13th generation. Thank you for having me. Thank you for opening the door so I can tell my story. I'm learning as I'm going along. This was presented to me in 2017 when I found out who I'm a fruit of. And it was just so amazing to see the resilience and the strength that my great-grandfather exhibited with having only a 6th grade education to becoming Supreme Sachem over the Wampanoag Nation. And I'm just here wanting to help us heal, because we need to heal. We need to heal. So I'm learning. I don't have as much knowledge as these people here, because this, like I said, was presented to me in 2017. And just the research in itself, he was in the Martha's Vineyard magazine over the summer, and it tells his story. And it's an amazing story. So there's a link for this as well if you all would want to read it at some point. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that's important to share with all of you as Native people, many folks believe that we all live on reservations, and that I've been asked here in Massachusetts how many There aren't any Native people left here in Massachusetts, and particularly on the East Coast. I come from the Cherokee Nation. We originated in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and what's called now the Great Smoky Mountains. And we were removed in the 1830s. As some of you know, the Trail of Tears, we were forced marched from that part of the world to Oklahoma Indian Territory. Most of my walking stick family is in Oklahoma and remains in Oklahoma. My mother was born in Muskogee. Her name was Betty Walking Stick, or Woody Odenisti. I grew up in suburban New York. So when my walking stick family came to visit with my grandfather, my grandmother, my classmates would ask if they were going to set up teepees in the yard. And so one of the things that we struggle with is a lack of knowledge and understanding, which is no one's particular fault. I mean, you can't control the education you might have gotten in school. But part of every person that's here is trying to help folks understand more deeply and to get a sense of who we are as Indigenous people. We all are part of the earth and understand our connection to the land, even if we're, like me, not in my homeland. We want to help encourage and educate and build relationships, because what's most important in it today is really a beginning of building relationships. So I want to remind Allison that we all come from different places, and we learn our language in different times. Many of our nations don't have very many native speakers. Cornelia is fortunate to have many native speakers, but many of those in our tribal areas, even on reservations, are dying off. We've spent generations of folks who were forced to learn English or not speak their language. We have a variety of history, and particularly on the East Coast, that early contact caused and demand for people to assimilate, either forcibly or other ways, has made it even more complicated in this part of the world. So we're here to begin a relationship and a conversation. I'm going to ask a couple questions, and everybody can chime in as you feel comfortable. First of all, what do you want folks, what would be one thing you'd like people to remember from today, to know about Indigenous people? All right, Brad.
I always say that, like I said earlier.
You can tell he's a teacher.
Oh yeah, I know, right? Right? You got me. So I always say we're still here. You know, you'll hear it constantly, but not only are we still here, but we're constantly looking towards the future. So I hope you all leave here knowing that there are constant efforts right now that are growing in Indigenous communities all throughout this area, but elsewhere as well. And I do think that the future will be Indigenous-led. I hope you all can see a lot of the efforts that folks are trying to engage in their communities, including food sovereignty efforts, climate change efforts, efforts to really take care and restore the land. Even here in Plymouth, engaging with the folks that want to dump radioactive stuff in the bay. And it's those kinds of things that Native folks are leading on the forefront of right now. And we're growing, we're developing our own organizations. As you guys might know, there's all new things popping up all over the time. I think of great institutions like Tamaquag Museum, the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, all different kinds of things that are growing and developing within our communities that you all can contribute towards or learn more about. So I always say, keep learning about us. We're still here. There are actually 573 federally recognized tribes. That means there are 573 little kind of countries, sovereign nations living here in the United States. So I always challenge you to learn more about them and to learn as much as you can and talk to us. So I hope you leave here today with that.
I think for me, I would like to continue to know, and also, like my brother said, to know the history. You know, there are many, many tribes throughout the United States. There are more than 300 tribes. And many are recognized and many are not. And just because that they're not recognized doesn't mean that they're not here. Their ancestors are here among us. Just before we walked in here, we prayed about that. We said, we know you're here with us, our ancestors, and we are your hope and we are your voice to use us as you need us. It's not easy for many to be here to tell truth and to tell the stories and to tell history because of trust has been broken. Relationships were broken. But now that we're now moving into this new way of becoming a people together, we need to build partnerships, and that's my hope, to build a relationship. And I truly believe that because, you know, where I come from the Navajo Nation, we have our stories, we have our creation stories. I just told one yesterday, I just shared one yesterday at the sermon yesterday about how our sacred bird, turkey, was the carrier of sacred medicines and seeds, and that she was the one who people least expected to carry such medicines. You know, we're always expecting and seeing something more, like a strong bird, such as like an eagle or a hawk. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, here comes turkey humbly coming in, and the people are scattered in chaos and anxiety and wondering what they're going to do into this next world. And all along, turkey was carrying these sacred seeds, and she expands her wings, and all these medicines that fell from her, these medicines, they fell on the ground, and she assured the people and said, look, look, look here. It's right here. And that's how the Native people continue with their spirituality, their strength, because that's what gives me hope as well, to continue these stories. And my hope is to tell the stories. My hope is to write about them. My hope is to continue ways that we might be able to do that, to encourage young people to write their poetic stories, their poetic prayers, because it's in them. The ancestors' poetic prayers and stories are within them, and they can write them. And that's a way of healing. And I think that when we do this, a little bit part of me heals. A little bit then part of Earth Mother heals. So when we continue to do this and, you know, providing space such as this to do this work, to do this ministry, it's healing ministry. It's a way that we're learning how to become relational with others, and then eventually our hope is at some point, you know, many may be ready to move into some reconciliation work, but many are not. We're not there. There's so much work, there's so much trauma, there's so much historical trauma out there that we need to go through. And it's not one of those things where it says, okay, well, we check mark off this and we check mark this. No, it's not about check marking these things that we need to address, and we need to address them, these historical colonialism traumas that we carry today that is affecting our children. And when my sister here spoke about language, yes, in Navajo land, we have our elders who are very strong in language and songs and prayers. And I was fortunate to be brought up in a Navajo-speaking family, because my great-grandmother and my grandmother were Navajo-speaking. It was the only way I could talk to them in Navajo. And then, of course, my dad was a Navajo-speaking deacon, and so was my mom. They worked in the church for a very, very long time, both of them. And they carried the services in Navajo. But today, our young people are not, they don't have the language to carry on with. but it's our responsibility to do that. One of the ways that the church in Navajo land, what we're working on and doing is, through this healing ministry, is to preserve the Navajo language. And the way we do that is through our songs. We sing Jesus Loves Me in church probably every Sunday or every other Sunday, and I say, hey, congregation here, we're going to sing Navajo so that we can sharpen up our Navajo language. And so we say, Jesus ayo ashotne ben alsos yeshel chalne. And the more we say that, and it's redundant, it's repetitive, then our people are slowly picking up the language, just like the story about the seeds. It's there, and we need each other to help us continue to heal in this way.
Thank you. As she was saying, like, the healing is very important. We have to take the Band-Aid off. We have to. And allow history to be retold. We can only heal from the inside out. You keep covering up with a Band-Aid, it's not doing anything, because we're still hurting. We're still living, all this trauma. So that's why I'm here. We need to form an alliance. And because it's just important. Just reading over my own history, my own lineage line, and all of the things that happened with my great-grandfather being burned out, not once, not twice, but 3 times in his lifetime. As a little boy, then when my grandmother was born, and then as he was on the island on Dukes County Road, and his wife succumbed to that. She died, his 3rd wife. He was married 4 times, okay. So we have to take the Band-Aid off. We have to. It's essential for healing and growing, because we can't grow if we aren't able to tell our truths and to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I think important to ask all of you, and is there one person or way that's been a helpful model for you, dealing with trauma, anxiety? One of the things that happens in our Native community, we refer to it as intergenerational trauma. Most of us have relatives, family members that were in boarding school or shipped away. On the East Coast, many of our young, small Native children parents were said that they were not taking good care of their children, and so were adopted out of their communities. And so there's an awful lot, what you're hearing is an awful lot of intergenerational trauma and things that we've all absorbed and listened to. When I was elected bishop, I took my mother, I was invited by Wilma Mankiller, who was the former chief of our tribe, to come out to Tahlequah. It was right after 9/11, and they wanted to have a healing service, and we had so I took my mother, Betty, walking stick with me. My mother knew her language, but didn't really use it at home, and I didn't quite understand why. She had a lot of trauma growing up. Oklahoma in the 20s, 30s was a very violent place. If you think about it, there was a huge oil boom, and land and money and oil were more important than human beings. And so my grandfather walking stick was an oil scout, so she lived in oil camps and things like that. So I took my mother back to Oklahoma and gave her the opportunity visit some places that we knew, and the little Cherokee Children's Choir, now it was in a Baptist church, so it was in December, and they were already singing Christmas carols. I didn't say anything, I behaved myself. Anyway, they were singing Christmas carols in Cherokee, and I saw my mother down in the congregation and thought she didn't look good or something was really wrong. And I said, "Are you okay?" afterwards, and she said, "I'm fine." I remember sitting on my auntie's lap and singing these Christmas carols in Cherokee. And from that point on, she was totally speaking Cherokee to me the whole time. And it's not just my story. This is stories of families across our country, recognized or federally recognized or unrecognized, state recognized or not. Our people have been often had to put away their traditions or put away the way that we understand just to get by, to live, to survive. So is there one way or a person or something that helps you with that moving from just survival to thriving?
I'll go again. Well, you had me like right away. I kind of knew what I wanted to say here. So for a long time, we were not allowed to practice our spiritual beliefs. We weren't allowed to speak our language. And today, that's why the Wampanoag language has been recovered. And we currently have a reclamation project that was started by Jesse Little Dobard. And is one of probably the most important and amazing things going on in this country. I think of that in particular because it's a story of not only surviving, but thriving and moving forward in meaningful ways and reconnecting us to our language. Because as Jesse will say, the language is the land and the land is us. So I think first of the language, primarily when I'm speaking of that. But I also actually think of an inspiration of mine that's quite far away. I've always been inspired by the work of Desmond Tutu and the work that he did in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Today, South Africa still has many lingering problems from apartheid, but when it came down, Desmond Tutu and many of those folks did a lot of work to tell the truth and to have folks sit in the same room together who hurt each other or hurt one another in horrendous ways because it needed to be said. And I think that that's one of the most important things that we have to still do, is things still need to be said, pain still needs to be expressed because it wasn't allowed to be expressed. In Aquinnah, we talk about walking two paths, and we say this because many of us were coarsely converted to Christianity. Because of that, many of us would walk two paths, which meant you would pray and do ceremony the way that the church wanted you to when it needed to be done, and you would engage in traditional ceremony when eyes weren't looking. And you could speak when eyes weren't looking. But when you're living in your own land and you have to hide everything, it has an impact on you, and it's painful, and we still carry that. Intergenerational trauma is real. It is a very real concept that the field of psychology recognizes. It's something that we talk about when we talk about the Holocaust, and it's something we need to talk about when we talk about Native Americans here in the United States, is there's an intergenerational trauma we're carrying. And so I want you all just to think about that, because it's something that my kids will carry with them, and hopefully it's something we break, and each generation breaks a little bit more of the chain. In many ways, some tribes talk about the seventh generation and how it will break that chain ultimately. And for some tribes, they are entering now into their seventh generation of youth since colonization happened, or even longer since then. And being one of those people, being 29 years old, I can say that we're ready to break it, to break this chain. But we need everybody, and that includes all of us here.
What I want you to take away today from me is that on our reservation, we have to show ID. Why should we have to show ID where we were born? I can't go on the burial grounds where if they come, the city people come down, we have to show ID. We don't even have a key to the gate. It's not okay. It's not okay. So that's what I want you to take away, is that we're being restricting on land that actually belong to us. We need to heal. That's my whole bottom line, is healing is essential for growth. You won't grow if you don't heal. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot one thing. Being in museums, I talk about a lot of different museum kind of sections and how they kind of intersect with Native folks, because museums are really a result of colonial conquest. They're a way to show off things that were acquired through colonization, and also to preserve things. But in many ways, a lot of museums have their start in the colonial conquest. And I always raise people's awareness to what's called NAGPRA. It's the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act. I always mix up the last few letters. But the point of that legislation is it wasn't actually passed until my lifetime. But it actually protects Native American grave sites and creates a repatriation process to return those objects to the tribes. Today in Massachusetts, a lot of the institutes throughout the state still aren't NAGPRA compliant, which means that there are the bones of our ancestors possibly in those museums, not where they belong. And there's sacred objects in these museums, not where they belong. And a lot of them have been ripped away from even further homelands. There are objects here in the state of Massachusetts that come from Dene homeland, and that's not okay. They belong home, where they were created.
Yeah, I was just thinking about my own healing, and where do I go for it, you know. When that word comes about, I mean, it's like a whole history of all kinds of memories come up for me. And one of the ones that I often sometimes think about is my mother, when she told me that when she went to boarding school. And she was a young girl, and she lived with, you know, of course, all her siblings and my grandpa, my grandma, and she had to go off to a boarding school to learn and how to speak English and how to get by in this world that was turning mostly into Western culture. One of the things that I do remember her telling me was when she would go to bed at night, she would cry herself to sleep. And she said that because I think what I asked her was, Mom, how did you keep the language? How did you still speak to us very strong in our language? And she said, well, at night, during the day when we were forbidden to pray and speak our language, she said at night I would get under the covers and I would whisper a prayer in Navajo. And that was the way I stayed connected, and this way I kept the language strong, was at night when I would pray at night in my language where nobody could hear. And that haunts me today still, thinking about that. I think about things like what she might have went through, and what it must have felt like to be taken away, so far away, even though, and into a whole different culture. And so she also did mention that in school, when the teachers would talk to her and ask her questions, they would say it in English, and she said she didn't know what they were saying. She didn't know what the white teachers were saying, and she couldn't respond, so she would just cry. and because she didn't know how to respond, because she didn't know what was being said and asked of her. When I learned of those stories from my mother, I was very angry, you know, and I carried that with me. But the way that I found healing was my mom always talked about forgiving and to continue to build relationships, because there are people out there who will listen, and they will continue to help. And so those were one of the ways that she taught me. Was what she said was which means it runs through the lineage of relationships and being relatives, how to be relatives to each other. And so, you know, over the years, I continued with those teachings from my mother, and she's always been my strength and my life. She's up in her 80 years, more than 80 years right now, and she's very strong. She really helped us get through the pandemic as well, and especially when the pandemic hit the Navajo Nation terribly, and all Indigenous communities terribly. I mean, we're very susceptible to these illnesses that were very foreign to us. Just yesterday, I was at the museum and I read about the coastal natives along this coastline, these shores. There was an epidemic as well that wiped out all Indigenous peoples in this land from the foreign disease that were carried here. I was, you know, how to get through all that. So, you know, even in the reality of this time, that the pandemic really hit hard also, and I had to find ways to help connect my people together. We had to learn from being a people of the land to the people of Zoom. and our elders are not used to internet, Zooming, or any of that. But us young people, the young people had to really teach us and learn how to do that, because it was the only way we connected. You know, I didn't see my mom for like three months or so, because my aunt and my mom didn't know how to do the FaceTime. And my cousin finally had to help them through the phone to tell them how to do that. And when I saw my mom on the phone 3 months later, we just nearly cried, just looking at each other over the phone, because our mom couldn't come home she was in Winslow, Arizona with my aunt, with her sister. And it was, oh wow, I don't know how just seeing my mom's face through the camera was such a joy. And through that whole pandemic, we were faced with a lot of death, and our people had to bury a lot of their relatives. It seems like every week, and that's even in a trauma in itself, because what happened there was no running water in some of these areas, isolated areas. There's no electricity. Healthcare was far away. Our elderly couldn't, you know, get to some of these places in time. Most of them died there on the reservation, isolated so far. And finally, it was like, after all these years trying to ask for water, electrical hookup, running water, finally, some of that money was finally passed, and we were given some funding to help with water. And we wonder, what took so long? Was it that it had to be the pandemic? You know, and that for me is an injustice to the Navajo, to the Indian people, to all Indian people along all this land. And so water was the main thing that was needed to wash our hands, to wash, what they would say was like, to wash your hands for like 20 seconds or so. And we only have a small, our elders only had maybe 3 barrels of water to get them through the week, so they had to conserve. And imagine only using a little bit of that same water just to wash your hands. And that's the reality. That's the reality of Indian reservations, is that this is still happening. This is still going on our reservations. Helicopters were coming in. It just felt like where I live, I have a family sheep camp. And the sheep herder, I was out there with him one day during the pandemic, and all we could hear was helicopters going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it was transferring the indigenous native peoples off the reservation to the nearest hospitals, which was either Phoenix, Albuquerque, or Denver. And most of them never came home to see their family. They never got to say goodbye. Many of the families there on the reservation, they all live in one household, some of them, because we're all closely related and the families live nearby on the sacred land. And most of the families who were living in the same household all passed away. And I had one family that I buried that was all from one family. And that was my uncle, my aunt, and 2 of their children. And even that stays with me. I mean, so how do I heal from all the traumas? That's just what we call systemic racism, that's real. It's institutional racism, systemic racism. And it's neglecting the people's needs. So today, part of my healing is I found during the pandemic was I go out into nature, and I've been riding my bike. It was the only thing I was able to do. And there I learned that my relationship with the Earth Mother and with Creator and with Jesus became really profound. And it became a healing time for me, because what I learned out there was, the juniper brushes, the sage, the earth, the sun, the rain, when it rained and mist, and even in the snow, they were all living in harmony. They'd have a lot to teach us, our creation around us. And the more I learned from them, it's like, wow, it's just like there are whole people out there, and they're learning, they know how to live with each other, and they're in harmony, and they feed each other medicines. So, that's my spiritual practice, and I give that away. I offer that to other people, and this is how you can heal. And I bring out the Navajo traditions, the Navajo medicines as well, and that we continue to use that with our prayerful practices.
Thank you. One last comment or question, I guess. What is one thing you hope will happen in the next coming years, from where we are right now? Just one thing, and then we'll stop and have some time for questions from the congregation. She's getting braver.
Yes, because I was very anxious. I didn't get much sleep, I want you guys to know. Because all this energy is... When I made my pilgrimage last year, I just felt the energy. It was like, oh my goodness, you're home. Your grandmother ran through these woods. Your Aunt Nada ran through these woods. Your father ran through these woods. So... Can you repeat the question again? Because I went off topic.
That's right. Just one thing you hope for the next years?
Is that I hope before my chief leaves this earth that our reservation can have running water, electricity, and do we get our rights to our land back? That's what I want to see. My great-grandfather was a great advocate for all of these things, and 1938 we were granted some things that still haven't been honored. So that's all I want. So we can start making some of our own generational wealth and not living in poverty anymore. We shouldn't be living in poverty at all, you know? So that's what I want.
I would say land back, more land back efforts, definitely. I'm kind of speaking in kind of like sound clips now, but like honor the treaties as well. There are a wide variety of treaties in which the U.S. federal government and states have engaged with tribal nations that are not honored for X, Y, or Z reasons. I always would bring up Mount Rushmore because Mount Rushmore is built in the Black Hills, and that's a violation of a treaty that was signed. And it was built largely after they found gold, which was a reason to ignore the treaty. And then later it becomes Mount Rushmore, and that the person who builds Mount Rushmore also builds that Confederate monument down south. It's a very dubious thing. And so I would like to see more efforts to have justice for Indigenous people. I would like to see more people acknowledge the fact that Indigenous women go missing and are murdered at much higher rates than any other demographic group, and are particularly targeted in places such as reservations where there isn't a heavy law presence always. And sometimes that law presence can even be culpable in some of these crimes. And so I always encourage you to go out and to learn more because these are very real issues in our communities. But like I said earlier, I think Native folks offer a way forward for all of us, something for us all to learn from. And I just ask that you engage in those conversations. So if you change anything in the next year or two of your life, I would say that it would be to engage in more conversation and relationship building, like we've been talking about here, so that we can understand each other better and build towards that future together.
I think that for me, what I would like to see, first of all, first and foremost, I want to thank the Episcopal Church for this time to hear our voices and to continue to pave the way for us, what we call truth-telling, reckoning, and healing. And that I hope that, I know that this is an Episcopal event where two dioceses are coming together to make this happen and to hear the voices of Indigenous people happen and to be heard. And I hope that across the whole Episcopal Church, this becomes a reality throughout all the dioceses, that they will also make a pathway for us for all the Indigenous peoples to begin to tell their stories in their geographic areas. And that's the way healing's going to happen. That's the way justice works happen. That's the way the Jesus movement happens. And that's the way that we continue to become relatives and relational through our church is doing this work. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was sitting here and listening to all of our stories is that, we have to continue to make safe and brave space for our people. Continue to have resources available for our communities, healing resources available for our communities. maybe, even reaching out to our Indigenous brothers and sisters and asking them, what can we do to help? How can we make healing happen for you? They'll know, because they're the ones who know what would be the best way to move us forward in this healing ministry together, this justice ministry together. And that like right now we have land acknowledgements being created in each of our worship services and our places, because we're acknowledging the peoples of that land. And that's a part of a healing part of our work, and even acknowledging our Earth Mother and our Father Sky and the surroundings. And also, I think a big part of our ministry is to continue forward to really continue to listen to each other, because listening is going to be a huge part of how we're going to be moving forward. So I think I would like to continue to have all of us create space for each other so that we hear more of the Indigenous stories. And just like Brad talked about, part of my ministry in Navajo land is providing safe space for Indigenous women that can heal from the traumas that they carry. Because even today, we don't hear much in the news about the murdered and missing Indigenous women across this land. We have actually a Navajo woman who's walking thousands of miles, who started her journey actually where I live on the Navajo Nation, from Sweetwater, New Mexico, which is like about maybe an hour from my homeland. She just barely made her way into the state of Virginia, and she's making her way all the way to Washington, D.C., and she's walking on behalf of her aunt who's gone missing early this year. And as she's walking along, I've been hearing, I've read a little bit of part of her story, and she said that sometimes it's really hard to move forward. It's really hard to get up the next day and to go again. But something that's happening, and that walk for her is helping her to heal. And she's just doing this walk to make a move, to make us to move, to move and to do something, and to begin to speak on these issues that is really important to the Native people. And we're not invisible people. We're here. we carry a lot of the stories, and that's what I would like to continue for us to move forward with. Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. No, go ahead.
It's kind of really pertinent to today. Before my great-grandfather passed away, he wrote a letter to the Boston Herald. And he said, "I am sorry that any so-called group of Americans assumes the right to classify the descendants of the original Aborigine, called unfortunately by Christopher Columbus, Indians. He wrote, 'We are not and never were Indians. We here were Wampanoag.'"
Thank you. I want to thank our speakers for sharing a part of their story. So let's thank them. And I'm going to hand the microphone off to H. Mark. He's going to do diaconal duty by, if you raise your hand, he will come to you and we'll try to answer your questions. We may not have answers, but we'll do our best.
Thank you, H. Mark. I have a question. I grew up in Wampanoag land in Braintree, and our symbol for our high school is a Native American wearing the wrong headdress for a Woodlands Native American. And I know there's a movement on to get people to remove those symbols from their high schools and things like that. I've been told my great-grandmother is Native American. I'm not. I need to trace it back. All I get is stuff written in French. And I took Spanish in high school, so I have no idea what they're talking about. So my question to you is, I never ever want to forget that I grew up on Wampanoag land. I now live in Weymouth, which is West Augusta. What can we do? I don't want to really lose that Native American symbol for our high school, but I don't want to be insulting to my Native American, possibly ancestors and friends that I have made. And I don't ever want to forget where I grew up in Wampanoag land, on Wampanoag land. What can I, as a white person, do to honor my ancestry of growing up on Wampanoag land?
Thank you. I'd love to jump on that. I think I'll just start by sharing a little bit of my experience, because for many years of my life, I did not have the opportunity to grow up in Wampanoag land, unfortunately, and my connection to the tribe was largely through my grandfather and through visits and through traveling, because my parents moved to Wabanaki territory, which is Maine. Maine is home to 5 tribal nations. They're the Wabanaki Confederacy. And Maine, now it must be 3 years ago, they banned Native mascots about 3 years ago from the state level. I went to Skowhegan High School and graduated from there. It was the last Native American mascot in the state of Maine. We were the Indians. And I was asked on several occasions, I never went to a pep rally after freshman year because I couldn't. People would ask me to bring in my headdress. And I used to be like, we don't even wear those. Because they usually are Plains-style headdresses belonging to tribes much further west of us. And they don't even recognize our own cultural practices. I used to be asked, well, you should just be the mascot. And that was really harmful for my identity development, my own life. And school kind of became like a living nightmare in a lot of ways. And it was unfortunate for me because I actually never really learned about the Wabanaki people in class, despite there also being a law in the books that says that the state of Maine had to teach about them. And so I always, as an educator, think that the way forward to honor and recognize your own ancestry, but also Wampanoag people, but whoever you're kind of indigenous to your area, is to involve them in your curriculum, involve them directly in curriculum design, involve them in assessment, involve them in school-level decisions that make a huge change, involve us in sports and athletics, and help us be involved in that world as well. Because there's a lot of things we could teach you guys. Wampanoag people have been playing a form of essentially what is called beach football for thousands of years. I always joke that it's kind of kindly called football because it can get more like rugby, where you're just kind of hitting each other pretty hard on the beach. But you avoid a lot of conflict that way too as well. You get it all out there. So like there's a lot of ways I think that schools and communities can honor Native folks that don't necessarily lead to trivialization or using stereotypes or anything like that. Because I have found that oftentimes the effect of mascots is much more negative than even the most well-meaning people want them to be. Whether it's watching a Kansas City game and having to deal with them war whooping, or tomahawk chopping. And it creates these notions that we are only violent people, when in reality, we're actually quite the opposite. Especially Wampanoag people, especially, like, a lot of people see our, like, root clubs, and the first thing they think of is, wow, you must use those, like, fighting people, because they're these really beautiful designed clubs made from the root of a tree. And most of the time, we're using them dancing, or we're using them in storytelling, and then occasionally, if we have to, We might use it that way. But that's how we are as people. And I think one of the things that I ask schools to walk away from is just to listen to more Native folks. When I was a part of the whole thing going on in Maine, it was really strange because the folks who wanted it to change were Wabanaki, and the folks who wanted to keep it weren't. And we kept hearing like the same kind of general messages that they wanted to honor us respectfully in many ways. But we recommended doing it different ways and to engage in those more meaningful relationships at like a curriculum level in a lot of ways. So I always advocate for that. Include Native folks in your curriculum development. It fits in every single thing, math, science, English, social studies especially, fitness, whatever it is, the arts. We are doing those things, so include us. It's the best way to involve us.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gregory Dolnikovsky. I have a friend who's a curator at the Haffenreffer Museum in Brown, and there was he said something on Facebook about there was something that happened there with regard to I think it was with regard to the Wampanoag interaction with the museum, and I just wondered if you could tell us anything about that, if you know anything.
I'm unaware, I guess, of the direct specific incident that you are talking about. I can say that there have been incidences with institutions as well before in the past. I can't speak to this one specifically because I'm not familiar with the specific context. I do have friends that interact with that institution as well. But overall, a lot of our institution to tribal relationships haven't been, I would say, 100% great. Unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with us coming in after the fact and finding things that, quite frankly, shouldn't be there or should have been taken care of elsewise. NACPRA, in a lot of ways, I think changes even people's opinion about Egyptian mummies. Because when you think about the fact that King Tut spent a significant time here in this state, we were watching somebody's ancestor on display and having it be disrupted from wherever it was originally intended. And a lot of times today, whenever we dig, for example, at Plymouth Patuxent Museums, if I even want to put up a sign post, for example, I have to have an archaeologist on site to help me. And we make sure that we check the area, and we check for remains, we check for cultural objects. And things are done much better today. Unfortunately, the field of archaeology and anthropology have a pretty troubled history with Native folks, and both of those fields, in a lot of ways, have some of their starts in looting, unfortunately, or studying people as objects. And so there's a great chapter by Vine Deloria Jr., sorry, messed up his first name. And it's called Anthropologists and Other Friends.
Yeah.
And it's great because he talks about a lot of this stuff, and he does it with this great sense of humor. But I can't speak on that specific situation, and I'm sorry about that.
Other questions? And over here.
With all the talk about healing and the focus on healing, how do you, if you could speak to how you as people who are seeking to heal past traumas while current traumas are being incurred? I mean, it seems to me every day without water is a repetition of a traumatic offense. So you're healing at the same time you're looking at future or current damages being done. And I just would like to hear from you, how do you deal with that?
I'm going to start because I think one of the challenges we face I just want to say that the gift of having these three folks here is them being very brave to offer a really intimate understanding of what it means to be an Indigenous person in this day and age, which is to be completely misunderstood, often, chastised sometimes for not being traditional enough, or being too traditional, or being too Christian-y, or not Christian-y enough, or those kinds of things. So I think one of the things that I lean on is my relations with other folks, and Cornelia and I laugh a lot, right? And in Native communities, one of the ways you know you're part of the community is if people start teasing you, then you know you're part of the community. And that's a simple way to say it's very difficult, and a lot of prayer, a lot of walking in nature, as Cornelia said, and stepping into places that are very uncomfortable causes a lot of trauma.
Yeah, I think it's a both and, I'm finding that the spirituality of paradox is a gift. How do we heal ourselves as we're walking, and then how do we heal ourselves in this time? That relationship with a paradox that is so beautiful and divine, yet also very traumatic and hurtful, yet there's a peace within that. Peace doesn't always mean peace. Peace is going to ask us to struggle. Peace is going to tell us to go into the farthest corners that is so difficult, so lone, so maybe it may feel like it's not even a healing place, but yet it's healing. Paradox is taking us to a place where it's going to tell us, I'm afraid, but I have courage. That's healing in the midst of that. I think it's where Jesus really takes us to that place of what we would call harmony, where we find that balance within ourselves. Like for instance, when I was talking about when I'm out in nature, oh man, I'm just like totally just there. And then I'm like moving back into the town, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling anxious, But then what I've learned from nature, I bring it into the towns. So it's a both and. I find that paradox is where the answers are.
Could I add to that just briefly? Sure. I think Carol touched on something that's really particularly important to Native communities, and that's humor. Like, as surprising as it is, my grandfather, who I'm named after, who I carry his namesake, Eagle Two Hearts, very much so, as one of the last things he said to me before he passed away last year, was that we are a laughing people. And he told me to never forget that, and it's because it's who we are. For hundreds of years, we've made it through. We've gotten through a lot, and we continue to get through a lot, because at the end of the day, we can look at our relatives, our relations, and we can laugh. And we can joke about some pretty serious things, and some pretty tense times we're able to bring down through humor. Native folks are some of the few folks who can be very serious and humorous within the same sentence. Before the period even drops, we've laid a joke. And that's why I encourage you all to go watch Reservation Dogs if you haven't yet.
I said, hand back here, one back there, and one here, so. And I'm the timekeeper on top of everything. Oh, 6 more minutes.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question about allyship and those of us who live in this area, and in particular, things that we can do as individuals, as members of this parish and other parishes, and particularly with Thanksgiving, such a the holiday of Thanksgiving that brings up a lot of emotions in a lot of people. What are some things that we can do within this community to be closer with the Native community and the Wampanoags?
Yeah, that's definitely a question we get quite a bit at the museum. dealing with that story in particular, right? The 1620 time period in which English settlers are here and engaging in some sort of diplomatic efforts with my people. As a teacher, I've actually designed and redesigned lesson plans around Thanksgiving. You all are probably familiar with the National Day of Mourning that happens here in Plymouth as well. And supporting that's always a good effort, a good way to engage with that story and making sure that folks understand it and where it comes from. I would always engage with my students and tell them that this was something that happened because of Frank James, because of Wamsuta. And it's important why it happened, why it continues to happen. And what I did was I tried to employ a Micmac technique. The Micmac are people from northern Maine whose territory crosses the Canadian border. That border, again, is a colonial thing, so it's not something that the Micmac really recognize. But the Micmac talk about seeing with two eyes, so being able to see as a Micmac person from one, but as a non-Micmac person from the other. And I challenge other Native folks and non-Native folks to think about Thanksgiving as that kind of time period. I think we need to redefine it in many ways. I think it can be fine if it's about your family. The only thing that I think is particularly harmful to perpetuate is this idea of some sort of happy Thanksgiving feast that takes place around some sort of table. We don't even know what kind of bird they ate, let alone if it was a turkey. It just says fowl in the primary text. And so even when we're talking about it from the primary text source, we don't even know the whole story. That relationship that they engage with Massasoit, Usamiquin, Yellow Feather, that story is much more complicated than it's ever been told. And there's much more agency that belongs in the hands of people like Usamiquin, Samoset, Epinau, and other folks that were engaged in that time period. Teach about those folks. Epinau is a great example. He manages to become enslaved. And through being enslaved, he's actually brought all the way into Europe. He's put on as a show in London for the public to see. Epinau, being the genius he is, convinces them that there's gold in Martha's Vineyard. We all know there's no gold in Martha's Vineyard, or at least most of it's in people's pockets, I suppose. But Epinau manages to tell them there's gold, and they sail all the way back. Upon seeing the island, he jumps from the ship. And there are tons of Mishuns or boats that come out, arrows drawn, protecting him. And he becomes the sachem or leader of the island in many ways. And so Epinau has a story that needs to be told that people don't talk about. There are lots of folks that do. And we're talking about folks like Awashanks, folks like Weetamoo, who are powerful Wampanoag women, who are leading communities that need their stories told. Both of them will unfortunately lose their lives in conflict, colonial conflict. And so it's one of those things where I think more of the story needs to be told, even to our youth, because it's not a story that Wampanoag kids get spared. It's a story that we're taught very, very early. And it's a story that we recognize. That's why I always kind of have never enjoyed the game Cowboys and Indians, because as a Native kid, you always lose. You will always, always lose that game. And it's not fun. It really isn't fun. And so it's one of those things where we don't want to kind of perpetuate that romanticized history of the past. And so Thanksgiving becomes a holiday like many holidays, through careful kind of thought out efforts by individuals to make it some sort of a national holiday, a national narrative. But the true national narrative is that there are thousands of Native folks still in this country that still don't think that we have a reciprocal relationship. And we need to work towards reciprocal relationships. So kind of a long, nuanced answer, but I think you as folks can just be more truth-telling. Frank James's son used to joke around that it's not Thanksgiving, it's Thanks-taking. And he had a good point. I always just recommend, too, as well, reading Wamsuta's speech that the town did not allow him to give in 1970. I used to actually incorporate it into my civil rights unit in my class. So they read Martin Luther's I Have a Dream speech. At the same time, they read Frank James's speech about Plymouth and being Wampanoag. So I think that's some things you can do and consider on that time period.
I think we have to wrap up. You have one more question back there?
Yes, thank you. So my question, hi Cornelia, my question is Zena from Worcester. My question is, I heard you say that the land acknowledgement is one of healing. And I find myself in spaces where the land acknowledgement becomes part of the agenda and the program in a way that is just another thing. And so I'm insulted by that, actually. And I'm wondering, how do we move? In fact, I feel like it gives the dominant culture a pass that simply by acknowledging that there's no need for action. And so I'm wondering, what are ways that we can go beyond acknowledging things that our laws and our treaties have already told us for a long time? How do we go beyond acknowledging and moving into action?
No, thank you. I really appreciate that question because I too have been in a lot of those meetings. Every land acknowledgement I've been asked to give, even this one, I have to consider extremely thoughtfully. And I have stopped calling them acknowledgements. I've started to call them commitments. And I think that you need to design strategic goals around a land and water acknowledgement, because it's not just the land, it's the water. And you need to design strategic goals around that. So if you're making a commitment to acknowledge this land, then what are you going to actually do to help Native folks? Are you going to donate money? Are you going to give land back? Are you going to hire Native staff? What are you going to do? Native folks have had things said to us for hundreds of years, and I've had pieces of papers put in front of me when asked to sign things, and they mean nothing to the US government. So they mean nothing to me. So your land acknowledgements, unless you act, mean nothing. If I take a student's water from them and I acknowledge that I stole it, they'll still go thirsty.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank our panelists. I'm going to have a few announcements, but thank you all again for your gifts. I am going to do a few announcements, and then I think we have a couple other announcements that other folks are going to do. Just a few words about, because I don't have the directions for the lunch, so maybe Jennifer, you want to do the lunch in a minute. But we will have a service at 2 o'clock. If any of you would like to receive smudging, and smudging in its simplest is a way of cleansing in preparation for prayer and gatherings. I will have a abalone shell and a feather. I will spread the smoke over you. You draw it over your head, over your heart, and on your feet the way you go. And you're welcome to do that as we come in. If you do not want to receive that, that is fine. You can come in the side. I think there'll be bulletins on each side, but to make sure that happens, you probably should start filing in here about 1:45. And I hope you'll all stay for lunch and for our wonderful service with our 3 bishops this afternoon. Directions on eating. Okay. And I'm not going to say that word again. Just go.
So we have limited space in the parish hall, so we're going to ask if we can do lunch in 2 shifts. We're going to ask if we can do lunch in 2 shifts. If your last name begins with A through J, we're going to ask you to hold back. We're going to show some videos here in the sanctuary for you. And if your last name starts with the rest of the letters of the alphabet, H, whatever those are.